Hey everyone, today we're going to begin our kind of starting to get into the real lecture, the real meat of the course, and we're going to be talking about religion here in America, but more specifically, religion before white people. What we typically call in American history classes or in anthropology classes, the pre-Columbian America. Basically, the time period of Indian cultures and nativist cultures prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus and the Spanish and the French and subsequently the British. And also, towards the end of this lecture, we're also going to talk about the African religions, those again prior to the encounterment with white people for West African, Central African religions as they come and make their way to America, but prior to European contact. But then we'll also talk about with a significant period with when Christianity became um, dominant in certain areas of Africa and how Native Africans responded to that as well. So let's get started with our discussion about religion in the pre-Columbian America. So first, let's do a little brief survey of what we mean by pre-Columbian North America. So again, we're basically saying pre-Columbus, but it's just a fancier way of saying pre-Columbian. We're not talking about the country Columbia, but the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. And so this pre-Columbian era typically denotes this kind of entire history of indigenous cultures here in America, both in North America, Central America, and South America, but we're going to primarily look at North America because hence we're talking about his religion in America or AKA the United States. So again, we're typically when we say pre-Columbian, we're talking about this period prior to European contact because we're trying to understand and trying to uncover and try to discuss here what was the native culture like prior to the arrival of Europeans. Because even though European contact and native, there are still native populations of indigenous people groups here in America, whether it's particularly out west or reserved to many of these tribal grounds here in the United States or up in Canada to various tribal grounds or reservation areas among in Canada, the people are called the First Nation up there as opposed to Native Americans. Or there's still some places in Central America that are still very remote and that still have huge significant pockets of nativist populations and still practice native religions and native cultures and native dialects as opposed to the predominant lingua franca, which is just a fancy phrase in French meaning the common tongue or the language that everybody speaks in Latin America, meaning Spanish. There's still some pockets in the Yucatan Peninsula, there south of Mexico, as well as in the Amazon rainforest, where native cultures and traditions, also in the Peruvian mountains as well, where there's still some nativist cultures and languages and dialects that are still there. But however, we cannot deny the impact of European contact. And so this is why many scholars, historians, anthropologists study these cultures and trying to peel back the layers because still, even though there is a revival of nativist cultures and religions here in the United States and in Canada, uh, there still have been heavily and significantly influenced by European contact. So we still don't really know if the religions and cultures that are being revived today are actually true, are actually original. Because again, it's very hard for us to separate where is that contact with Europeans from these cultures. But this is what we're trying to do. This is the endeavor that we are trying to undergo here with a typical survey of pre-Columbian North America. And so when America, uh, really its entire history, has been a history of immigration. Typically you'll hear people say, well, white people weren't the first to come to America, that they immigrated and the Native Americans were here first. Well, actually, according to anthropological studies, the Native Americans actually migrated here as well. We don't know so far with our limited amount of studies that we have been able to do here in America because of just still such a vast region of territory to uncover. But what we have discovered is that the original Native Americans, many of them, actually migrated here to America, and it's suspected that they had migrated from across Eurasia, which is the combination of Europe and Asia together. So specifically Central Asia, as well as the eastern portions of Russia, and that many of the Native Americans actually doing DNA tests that they have similar parallels with many of those Central Asian nomads. And so it's believed that they had migrated across a patch of land that had once existed before the rise of sea levels or before the melting of some of the ice caps. That is known as the Barren Land Bridge, this connection between Alaska and Russia. And so that somehow these Euro-Asian nomads had migrated to this region around 14,000 to 20,000 years ago. And we do know, again, because of DNA studies, that many of the Indians that we have uncovered, many of the native populations that we have uncovered, that they share significant DNA patterns with those of Central Asia, particularly the ones that we found along the Pacific Northwest and even as far down as central Mexico, that we have still, with DNA studies, have been able to see that there are significant parallels, again, with Central Asian cultures and the Native Americans. So even the Native Americans themselves are immigrants to this land that they had come over about 14,000 to 20,000 years ago. But after the level of the sea levels have risen, the polar ice caps have reduced further and further back to where they are. That natural land bridge that once had existed is now gone. And so the Native Americans there has started to mingle with each other and start to develop specific dialects and cultures that are as opposed to those in Central Asia. And so these early Indians, sometimes you'll see the term Paleo Indians, but are sometimes just natives. I rather refer to them as native populations. What we see with them is similar parallels that we see across Eurasia and all of Africa, that these typical early settlers here to America were very much hunter-gatherers, lived in these various communities that were either characterized by small mobile bands or extended family members that were clumped together that could range from anywhere from 20 families to over 50 to 75 families, and that they would typically move with the terrain and move with the climate or move with the hunting pack in which they would survive. And so therefore it makes archaeological evidence very hard for us to understand because these hunter-gatherer communities were consistently on the move, so thus rarely did they actually leave significant structures, or thus many of the tools and the materials that they used were from animals. And so animals are biodegradable within themselves, and so many of the what we could know of any type of structures or civilization is just unknowable at this time. So they just were, again, very similar to what we see with Eurasian communities. They were small hunter-gatherer communities that had traversed various areas. But eventually, we start seeing Native American populations actually leaving artifactual remains. And so around 6000 BCE, we start seeing native populations starting to settle in what is the lower Mississippi River Valley. So that is today Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, Missouri, particularly significantly in Missouri, as well as parts of Illinois. But in the lower half, we still don't see a lot of Indian populations in the upper half, up to Minnesota and up into Canada. And then we also see, again, Indian populations starting to traverse in the Ohio River valleys. So Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, parts of Pennsylvania, and Western New York that we start seeing these communities develop. And one of the how we know this is because they all share a similar characteristic. And one of these main characteristics is the building and construction of these complex earthworked mounds. And so there's lots of mounds throughout the Southeast and Midwest America. Uh, for us here in Panama City, you could actually go to Tallahassee, and there is a remnant of a earthen mound work there in Tallahassee, just there. Um, Off Tennessee Street in Tallahassee, or you go further up closer to Tuscaloosa, or go in Alabama, or go to you know the northern parts of Mississippi, or in the you'll find areas where there are you know earthwork mounds that were constructed. These they would probably be as high as about 800 feet that we have uncovered so far, and so they're little hills that were built with earthen mounds. And so we typically don't know what the purpose of these mounds were. There's several theories behind them, as whether this was some early forms of religious worship, was this early forms of civilization. We really typically do not know, but we do know that they would consistently build upon them, and that we'll also have significant, uh, some burial mounds that were found inside the mounds as well. Some structure remains of some type of house, possibly, we theorize it was possibly similar to what we see in Mesopotamia, that, they would build temples to the gods on top of these earthen mounds, and where some type of priest system or some type of religious circle was there, or whether if this was some kind of palace structure. We just typically do not know, but we do see this happening. This again, dots along the Mississippi River, dots along the Tennessee River, the Ohio River, all these major rivers that flow into these two specific rivers. That, well, even the Ohio eventually runs into the Mississippi somehow as well. So we start seeing these populations and these earthen mounds starting to develop around the 6000s. But still, it seems like the native populations were still hunter-gatherers, and not so much do we see urbanization. We really get that here in North America around the 1000 CE period. And so it's typically referred to as the Mississippian culture. Again, because earth mounds are at the center of these communities. And so we find structures being built, and we see this transitioning away from hunter-gatherer communities in the eastern portion of the United States, or the southern portions of the United States. And these Indian populations start transitioning more towards domestic farming, particularly corn and squash, and soybeans, as well as this particular crop that would be used, that are very indigenous here to America. And so we have, eventually they start gathering, and because of domestication, because of urban farming or farming, you actually have urbanization. You have the creation of urban complex-like structures, and you start to see stratifications of societies, and also trade networks being developed. That we have evidence from archaeological evidence of trade routes from southwest Georgia all the way up to western New York, materials being traded between the various Indian populations and groups. And one of the most significant Mississippi cities, or of these Mississippian culture cities that we have, is you could go just outside of St. Louis. I believe it's on the Illinois side of St. Louis, but I could be wrong on which side of the river it is. But there's a huge complex. I forget the name of the city that's there, but a huge, massive complex that was believed to be a urban city because there was a presence of over 47, no, 80, over 80 earthen mounds found in this area of a couple of square miles. And based off the trajectory of all the earthen complexes, that it was possibly a city, an urban city that held anywhere from 20 to 40,000 Native Americans. And so the Native American population was significant at one point, and was at one time, for its period, technologically advanced in order to have large urban complex centers there. However, we do see prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus that the Mississippian culture here, particularly in the eastern portion of the United States, reached its apex and started to sharply decline, and more so with European context, because eventually, unfortunately, the Europeans brought with them diseases that typical Native Americans were not exposed to, things like the measles and smallpox, things that Europeans have built antibodies for. And so now we all know with the coronavirus epidemic how severe being exposed to some of these diseases, and Europeans had built up over time antibodies to these things, but yet the Native Americans were being exposed to them for the very first time, and thus dying in the thousands and possibly even the millions due to diseases. And so, starting around the 1400s, we start seeing a sharp, drastic decline due to European contact with Native Americans. So let's get on to talking about kind of a survey of Native American religions. That was the pre-Columbian cultures there in North America. So you can see a steady decline or steady progression from hunter-gatherer societies to urbanization, but also due to prior to European contact, but really specifically with European contact, we do see significant declines in their population. So it is believed by scholars. We really don't know because no one, there was never a census done. There was no records of this, but typically most scholars and anthropologists believe that by the time that the Europeans had begun to arrive in North America, that there were somewhere between 2 million to around 10 million Native Americans who were dotted all along North America, and that with them that there was possibly over 300 different spoken languages being spoken in North America. And so what that means is that the Native Americans are not a monolith, that they all had distinctive cultures. Some of those cultures were dependent upon the climate in which these Native American tribes lived in. That those in New England area, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, the Native Americans in those populations were significantly different than those culturally and religiously as well from those, say, in the Southwest of America. So Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. Significant differences between the twos. And so one of the biggest errors when talking about Native American culture and religion is that you cannot speak of a singularity. You cannot speak of Native American religion as one thing, but rather there are many things. There are many different forms of Native American religions, and thus it makes it extremely complicated to actually do a brief survey of Native American religions. It's quite impossible. You would really have to spend an entire semester, if not an entire year, to do justice to talk about Native American religions because there are so many and they are so uh, diverse. And sometimes each one, I might say something here and make some strong generalities. And the truth is that one of my comments here in this lecture could be contradicted by other information or by other experiences by other tribes. And so that's one of the huge problems with doing a study on Native American religion is that it's quite expansive, quite diverse, just as similarly diverse as Christianity here in America. That there's so many different forms of Protestantism. Think of the same way here for Native Americans. There are so many different forms of Native American religions, and they're all very different. They all serve different cultures. They all have different deities or different ways they express religion and different beliefs and practices. So again, we cannot speak about a monolith here for Native American culture like we could with Christianity. But we can make some generalities. Also, we have to remember that our knowledge of Native American culture and particularly Native American religion is probably compromised. I have here maybe compromised, but I would want to change that to is compromised by missionary tales and exposures to Christianity, because really early on, this is really where the bulk of our knowledge comes from Native Americans. Is that if we want to get back to the 1500s and the 1600s, that we are reliant upon Christian missionaries, Christian priests, who were charged by either the Spanish crown or by various conquistadors. You know, Columbus had with him a priest who traveled, and one of his main purposes was to write and then provide some kind of survey or some kind of brief report on the native religions that they were exposed to. And so many of these missionaries either wrote about these Native American religions with clear biases in place. Again, the goal of these priests was to convert many of the missionaries or many of the Indians, and so thus they weren't writing very positive or writing accurate depictions about the nativist groups. For example, Christopher Columbus, when he had arrived on the Isle of San Salvador, which is today, oh gosh, I don't think it's Cuba, but I think it's Puerto Rico. When he first arrived on his first journey, was he actually arrived in Puerto Rico. But when he was writing about the native population there, he remarked how that there were no religious structures, that there were no churches, there were no temples, and thus Christopher Columbus concluded that the people here were, quote, atheist. And he was wrong, because Christopher Columbus, like many of these other missionaries, the only thing that they could compare what religion is was that of Western religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, that have temple structures, that have holy scriptures, that have deities, that have savior-like figures within them, who have prophets. And so they typically were writing and doing comparative studies of these native populations, but they were doing it with Western biases, trying to understand these Native American cultures within a Christian context, more specifically. And so the knowledge that we have about the Native Americans well, truthfully, it's quite wrong. We don't really know because, again, we're coming from these missionary tales. And there was also another component with these missionary tales, is that many of them, many of the priests and many of these missionaries would write these texts, would write these stories about their encounter meant with the native populations in order to entertain those back in England, those back in Spain, those back in France, because many of the missionary writings were typically used as fundraiser campaigns. They would write about their adventures, oftentimes exaggerating the stories, exaggerating their tales, in order to garner support back home for their missionary funds. And so, again, many of these missionary tales, which are some of our earliest sources that we have of the native cultures and religions, are in fact a little bit propagandist or a little bit apocryphal. Because, again, many of these writers were trying to fluff their story. They're trying to write for entertainment purposes, for audiences back home, whether to entertain them or scare them into supporting the missionary cause. And then also, as I say here, exposure to Christianity. Again, many of the conquistadors traveled with priests. Many of the explorers traveled with missionaries. And so the missionaries were trying to purposefully Christianize the local communities. And so, of course, over time, with the Christianization and the exposure to Christianity, Native American cultures and religions started to look very similar to that of Europeans, started to look very similar to that of Christianity. So again, we don't know exactly if this certain belief of the Cherokee Indians, if this is actually original to them, or is this exposure to Christian elements that they had adopted and that they had been coerced into their own faith and have been subsequently corrupted, if we want to speak of it, of their traditions. So again, we don't know. And lastly, it's just time itself. European contact starts in 1492. A little bit earlier, if you count, the Vikings. But really, 1492. And so we have this over 5,000, 500-year period of contact with Native Americans, but Christianity has evolved in that time frame too. Christianity 500 years ago looks completely, significantly, drastically different than the Christianity that is here today. Muslim practices look significantly, drastically different than those 500 years ago. So the same is that of the Native Americans, that when Europeans contacted them, the Native American culture was significantly had already changed and evolved and developed. And so the Native Americans themselves didn't start writing, the Cherokees were the first Indians to really write down and preserve their own stories and tales, but they weren't doing that until the 1800s. So 300 years after the arrival of Europeans, they're starting to write down their stories and write down their tales. How accurate is their tales? How accurate is their reporting? Is it purely unbiased and unexposed to Christian thought and teachings? Highly doubtful. So thus we're compromised by time itself, naturally. So again, this is kind of my point of caution that some of the comments that we make here about Native American religions, they are kind of guesstimations. They are just generalities of what we're doing. And I'm not certain, too, of if what I'm saying is 100% true, because again, there are elements of doubt, significant levels of doubt, because of just the nature of the study that we're doing. However, there is scholars would say we can make some certainties, because we do have archaeology, we do have historical researches, we do have ethnographical observations, we do have the advancement of modern day studies. But ultimately, all that we can do is make generalities. We can't be specific. We might be specific about one or two things, maybe three or four things, but again, I'm quite cautious about our study and giving a survey of Native American religions and cultures, because again, it's really generalities. That's the best that we can do. All right. So now let's dive into it. So let's see, some of the most important aspects of Native American religion is that Native Americans, unlike us today, really do not distinguish between religion and other aspects of life. For the Native American cultures, they're really one and the same. I think, as Corrigan puts it here, that the Native Americans really have a holistic understanding of life, meaning that everything was seen as an existence in a particular relationship to everything else. Everything was correlated to one another. Everything was, I think, as Corrigan says, like a web this intricate web where everything is tied together. And so again, a Native American and their culture couldn't see the difference between culture and religion, between society and religion, between secular morality and religious morality. Everything is kind of blended together. So for them to be religious, or for us to talk about Native American religions, what we really ended up talking about is Native American cultures and societies, because they really are one and the same for a large extent. Uh, Again, yeah, as I have here, like Native Americans tended to perceive all things as this kind of interconnected web. But more specifically, they tended to look through stuff through the lens of the family dynamic or family relations. And so that the tribe, the tribal unit, was really the key to understanding everything there is in the world. That the world exists and is made through a tribal complex. And so to understand one's relationship to the universe parallels with understanding one's relationship to the tribe. And so it was interdependent. So again, Native American culture and Native American religion are inherently tied together. So for a good example, this is what I mean by, again, this kind of worldview of looking through the family dynamics. So for example, the Penobscot Indians had their idea about this creator god that they would call Kokubara. I think that's how you say it, Kokubarish. No, Koskubara. Yeah, Koskubara, who instructed man and this teaching after he created man, and he gives him instructions of how the world is to work and how the world is to function. He starts stating man to have, what kind of relationship man is going to have to the universe and to nature. And so one particular example is that man is to call the sun his uncle, to call the moon his aunt, to call the animals his cousin in spirit. And so that you can see everything is within the Pescop's Indian tribe, everything is related to one another. Even through the creator God, everything has an original source, but that source is understood through the family dynamics. Another example is the Osage Indians up in western New York. Their tribe were known as, they would see themselves as, we are the direct children of the sun, and that their rival tribes, and explaining how other cultures and other communities existed, and why either we go to war with this tribe, or why are we so different from the tribes down in Pennsylvania, who speak a different language and who may dress dissimilar from them, whose culture is completely different. For the Asagi Indians, they would say, well, we are the children of the sun, and everyone else are the children of the moon. So this relationship that you can see, again, family dynamics, and it creates this kind of worldview for them to understand how they are to function within it and their societies. Even for the Sioux Indians, that again, there's this tradition within them of naming animals. And so there's this story of the rattlesnake. And so for the Sioux Indians, there's this story of why the rattlesnake makes the noise. Why is it rattled? Why is it curled up? And it's trying, the noise of the rattle that is on the end of its tail. And for the Sioux Indians, it would say, no, this is the rattlesnake communicating to you. He is saying through the rattle, he's communicating to you, my brother, do not harm me, do not step on me. And so you can see this just basic allegorical tale of why it's smart not to step on a rattlesnake, to treat this kind of useful lesson, this very useful lesson, to try to treat the animal as a brother, as a kin. So again, the Native American have this kind of basic idea of what their society was. The society coexisted together, and it was explainable through the tribal dynamic, the family dynamics. And let's talk about here Native American kind of cosmology. So cosmology is just a fancy term for understanding the universe and understanding one's place within the universe. And so for what's interesting is that again, I'm not sure at this point if this is true or not. Meaning that how I have it phrased here is that most Native Americans had already developed a cosmology by the time we get to the Europeans or get to talking about them that had a cosmology very similar to the Abrahamic religions. Or is this how, again, Western Europeans understood the Native American culture and religion? That they could only understand it through their own cosmologies of Abrahamic religions? Or was this in fact true that they had something very similar to what Europeans have? I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical on this point because, again, most of the stories and traditions we have are coming from Christian sources. They're coming from later sources, um, from from the 1700s and 1800s that we have many of these tales about these Native American communities. So again, I'm kind of skeptical, but this is what scholars typically say, that no, Native Americans had already developed a cosmology, and their cosmology was very similar to that of Abrahamic religions. Well, how so? First is that what we see, many of the Native American religions had a cosmic creator, someone who created the earth and who either plays some type of active role in that of society or in the lives of its creation. So in the Abrahamic religions, what do we see? At Genesis 1:1, God creates the heavens and the earth. And then later in Genesis 1:26, we have God creating man and then creating woman. Everything is good. And then we have in Genesis 2, God interacting with man, looking upon man, seeing that man is lonely, tries to create animals to fill that gap. Animals won't work. Eventually decides, man is lonely. He needs somebody that is similar to him, but also different, and thus creating woman. And so you have this cosmic creator God who plays an active role in the lives of the person. But then you also have a creator God who's sometimes impersonal. So again, back in Genesis, you see God, in Genesis chapter 1, God is kind of impersonal. He creates by speaking, versus Genesis 2, where God is personal. God ends up creating. God, molds man out of the dust of the ground and creates man. God causes a deep sleep upon man and pulls a rib from the side of man and makes woman out of it. That God physically does stuff. He's quite personal. And so we have these similar things. Again, a personal God or also an impersonal God, but more specifically, this powerful creator God in the Abrahamic religions, whether it's Christianity or in Islam, the same kind of dynamic is there as well. So we have in the Cherokee creation myth, instead of this kind of powerful human-like creator God, we have this kind of impersonal creator God spirit that they known as the Great Spirit, who is not personified. He doesn't have hands, doesn't have feet, doesn't make man out of the mud, but rather speaks similarly to we have in Genesis chapter 1, that he performs no physical action, but rather speaks, and that he is the maker of all things, that he thinks and things begin to form and create itself. So something very similar to what we see in Genesis chapter 1. But however, we have in in Cheyenne mythologies, those in Wyoming, Montana, the Dakota regions, the Cheyenne Indians, that we have a god, again, that's very similar. They refer to him as the Great Medicine. And it's said, according to one mythology that we have among the Cheyennes that's written down, that in the beginning God created, or that in the beginning created the earth and the waters upon the earth and the suns and the moons and the stars, and that he put animals and birds and insects on the earth, and he made man. Again, very similar to what we see in Genesis or in the Quran itself. So some possible parallels here of this kind of cosmic creator God, an active role. Similarly to the Abrahamic religions, the Native Americans believed that humans were created beings. They were created from the gods or created from mythical events. So in Abrahamic religions, it's the all-powerful God who fashions humanity from his own creation. More specifically, for man, creates him from the dirt. For a woman, that he creates her out of man. Well, in the Hopi traditions, there in these are in upstate New York, the Hopi Indians. They have a creation tale about two wind goddesses. They're the two wind goddesses of a chief deity. So kind of this not paleo, polytheistic style religion or mythology here, that there's a creator God, but also that he uses agencies to create things as well. And so you have the creator God who causes through through wind to force the waters back from the land. And then, as soon as water, recedes from, the clay or recedes from the dirt, what is left there is mud. And it was out of mud that the Creator God fashions man from out of among the waters. So again, something very similar that you see in Genesis story as well. In an Apache tale, which is you have a similar order of creation for humanity, but it's reverse for instead of how it is in Genesis, and that the Son created woman and instead of man, and that the Son loved the woman so much that she gave birth to a child, and that child was man. So we do have something similar here. That out of God's love for humanity and God not wanting man to be alone creates woman. You have something similar here. It's still a stretch, but what's significant about the Apache tale is that it has the gender roles reversed. It is the woman, which man is created out of, and that she gives birth to a man. So again, similar to Abrahamic traditions here, the creation stories serve to create a particular worldview. And so in the Abrahamic religions, that's exactly what the Genesis 1 chapter 1 to chapter 3 do. They set up for the ancient Israelite community, the ancient Jewish community, the Christian community, the Muslim community. What the Genesis story does is it serves to create a basic worldview and basic theology. One being that there is such a thing as a creator God who created everything, and that his creation is perfect, and that his creation is called good, and that man is inherently good, but however, man had fallen. And so thus this explains why our evil nature, explains why we have lustful desires, is because of sin, things that we should not have done, and because we are tempted by outside forces, and thus we need to observe God's rules and God's laws, things like that. So this Genesis story creates a basic worldview and establishes it and creates a basic theology. The similar creation stories as well for Native Americans do the same thing. So in many of the Native American cultures, these cosmologies serve to either reinforce orientation of the people to the land, or the people to the tribe and their relationships within the tribe, or explain the things of, explain why things are just the way they are, explain why there is an ocean, why there are earthquakes. And so this little picture up here is from the Iroquois Indians up in upstate New York around Syracuse and Albany territory. And so the Iroquois Indians believe that the land arose from the waters, and that actually the earth is actually made up of a giant turtle, and thus explain why rivers flood all of a sudden, why there's earthquakes, why there are hurricanes, is because of the turtle is moving. And so, a similar basic cosmology of why things are the way they are as well, because we can't see it. We don't have the perspective of actually, well, we're on the back of a giant turtle. So similar stories like that. Again, they have a basic element that they serve. And then there's previous myth tales are also, again, these examples of, I've kind of already said this here, this kind of tribal relationships. I mean, that they reinforce the tribal context of, again, as we saw earlier, that, after the creator god of the Pascapi Indians said that you were to call the sun your uncle, you were to call the moon your aunt, you are to call your animals your cousins, to explain this tribal relationship in the way you are to respond within it as well. And then there's also, again, like in Genesis chapter 3, why is man inherently sinful? Why do we have a yearning? If God created us and creation is good, why do we do bad things? And there's the story of the snake and tempting Eve with the apple that she shouldn't eat, and then yet gives it to Adam, and Adam and Eve eat the apple and they sin, and that God is forced to force man outside of the garden and to live. The man is cursed. God curses the man to spend the rest of his days toiling for his family, to work the ground, to have to work hard to support his family, and that he curses the woman and saying that to provide for the man, to provide a family for the man, that you're going to experience pains of childbirth. And then God curses the snake and says the snake is now not to have legs anymore and is to crawl upon the ground and be a cursed thing on the ground. And thus, that kind of dynamic that we see in Genesis chapter 3, we also see it again in other myths tales as well. In the Apache, one of the Apache creation myths, because the Apaches live out on the plains of, originally lived on the plains of Oklahoma, Kansas, North Texas, Colorado, before being forced out to Arizona. That they believe that creation originally began underground, similar to what they see out in the prairies and on the plainlands of animals living underneath the ground, prairie dogs and stuff like that. That at one time all created things lived below the ground, and that man could actually talk to animals and could actually talk at trees. But however, the story goes is that this man created a game that was similar to, if you read the story, it's very similar to field hockey. And so there's theories about this is where the beginnings of field hockey actually began in America, through the Native Americans actually practiced it, and then British people saw it and eventually converted it into hockey or into lacrosse. But playing this game, that's, again, like I said, sort of like field hockey or lacrosse. Man invents this game to play with the animals in the trees, but unfortunately during the game, a hole develops in the earth, and man for the first time is able to see above ground, and he's curious and wants to go up there. Everybody says no, don't do it, you're not supposed to do it. But eventually man goes up and sees how amazing it is to live above ground, and encourages all the others to come above ground. And thus, when everything moves and starts to live above ground, unfortunately, everything becomes cursed. And thus, we are born from the ground and thus return to the ground. So that similar dynamic that we see in Genesis chapter 3 is also here in the Apaches myths. And then there's also another tale from one of the New England tribes of, I think it's in Massachusetts. I think it's the Massachusetts Indians, but I'm not sure. Of the Native American Indians in the New England territories. There's this trickster deity that they have named Mesho, who convinces the primordial man named Meek, so similar to the primordial man in the Bible, Adam. In the trickster deity like the snake, we have another trickster deity in Mesho, who convinces the primordial man to actually dive beneath the waters and to return up with mud from the ocean floor. And so that man actually does this, and the story goes, it's actually a funny story. The man dives really deep into the water, and he grabs, a whole pack of mud, and he's needing to swim back up to catch air. But because he's holding the mud, it's very impossible to swim and hold the mud in his hand. So instead, what Mink decides to do is he puts it in his mouth. And so he puts it in his mouth, and he starts to, be able to have a free hand, and is able to swim up. And so once he's able to swim up to dry air, and he wants to gasp for air, instead of gasping for air, he ends up swallowing the mud, and he gets stuck in his throat, and he's choking and he's choking, and so he falls on the ground, and Misho decides to save him. And so he decides to save him. He decides to do CPR on him, mouth to mouth. But instead of mouth to mouth, Mesho, it's funny, Mesho decides to put mouth to anus. And he puts his mouth on Mika's butt and blows air up his ass. And eventually the mud comes dislodged from his throat, and he throws up the mud. And subsequently, it's the mud that creates the earth. And the mud also, because it comes from this primordial water beneath the earth, this is where, for the Massachusetts Indians, this is where evil comes from, is because he was tricked and he threw up the ground that it had become cursed. But I always love that story because, again, it's CPR. It's supposed to be mouth to mouth, but Mesho decides to do mouth to anus and blows up hot air up Meek's ass, and out of his ass comes the earth. And which is quite funny, and why everything is wrong in the earth, wrong in society, is because Mesho blew hot air up his ass. But it's, again, one of my favorite stories from the Native Americans. So, besides this cosmology, the most common expression of Native American religions and ideologies and cultures that we see that is fully on display is, in fact, the performance of rituals. Ritualization is probably our best way of understanding and comprehending Native American culture and society, and more specifically, religion. And so all aspects of Native American life was, to some extent, was considered a holy exercise. Everything was governed by this certain particular understanding of the world, how it worked, and that it demanded, that the world really demanded from you to have a certain perspective and a certain procedure to help the world continue to go. And that's why we have in Native American cultures this ritualization. And so what rituals are they're both an exercise, how I have it here, an exercise in forming facts of daily existence. That rituals tell a story, um, at the same time reinforcing a specific worldview. So, I'll give you an example that probably many of you are quite aware of. And so, we'll give you the example from, uh, let's say, church, going to a Catholic Mass. Mass is a ritualization of, according to the New Testament, of the Last Supper of Christ. That before Christ was betrayed by Judas, that he performed a Last Supper for his community, for his group of disciples, in order to teach them about what was about to happen to him, to give him an example. And so that Jesus used the example of the Jewish Passover, the Seder meal, as an example of what was going to happen to him in the future, here in the next day. And that his blood that was going to be spilled upon the execution of the cross, that it was going to be shed for you as the sacrificial lamb that is to be happening during Passover, of the lamb being sacrificed for you and the protection of you of a vengeful God. And that the bread was to symbolize where Christ's body was going to be broken, and that he was going to take the punishment that was supposed to be designed for you. And so within the Catholic service, within the Eucharist, you are to come. The Eucharist is blessed by the priest, from the wafer to the wine, and that your consumption of it is your recognition of your part in the death of Christ, that Christ had to die for you, and that you take ownership of that fact by taking the wafer and drinking the wine. And so the Eucharist, with this ritual, serves to tell the story. Again, every time that you go to Catholic Mass, it is used to tell the story of Jesus' sacrifice for you, the gospel story, but then also to reinforce a specific worldview, that you are, in fact, the sinners in the hands of an angry God, but yet through the sacrifice of Christ, this angry God is supplicated by his sacrifice. So rituals have this purpose. So for another example, during the, uh, you know, gosh, I was trying to think of another example. My mind just went blank. So let's say, for example, I just thought of another one here. Um, for Muslims, when they go on the Hajj, the pilgrimage that a Muslim will go on at least once in his life or their life, that they'll go and that they will go during the holy month, one of the last holy months of the Islamic month. They will go and to travel to Mecca. And during their travel, once they reach close to Mecca, they are to enter into a state of ritual purity, in which that there is no illicit behavior being done, in which all Muslims are to exchange their clothes for white clothing that is to symbolize kind of the same clothing that is put on a deceased person, kind of these burial clothings that you are to wear, and go on pilgrimage. And where you go to Mecca, that you circumvent around the holy Kaaba stone in Mecca to symbolize the ritualization of where Hagar in the Quran and in both the Old Testament as well, in which Hagar, after being kicked out from the camp of Abraham by a jealous wife and Sarah, because Hagar provided a child for Abraham, Ishmael, that she's kicked out of the tribe, and that she and her son are having to force to live out in the wilderness, and that before they are dying, Hagar is searching frantically around for water, and she's praying to God for God to hear her, and provide water for her, and eventually God listens and provides water for both Hagar and Ishmael. And so part of the Hajj community, after going around the Kaaba stone several times, that there is a well that is there where people will drink water from to symbolize that they had indeed received the blessings from God. So within that one small act of the greater Hajj that people do, there is that moment of ritualization. So we see similar things again for the Native American populations. Rituals are a story. They're used to express a certain story as well as reinforce a specific worldview. So rituals are, like I say here, are a language. They're a language that is spoken with action and symbols as well. So in we all know probably the most common of the Native American rituals. And so one of the most popular examples from the Lakota Sioux Indian tribes out in the Dakotas, that they would typically perform ritual celebrations prior to going on to the hunt, in which that the tribes all participate in this massive celebration, this massive tribal dance, in order to prepare the community for going out on the hunt. And they were also, while going on the hunt, not only did it serve this reinforce the worldview that in order for the entire tribe to survive, they all have to participate in the hunt. whether it's the men who go out and hunt the bisons and go out and kill the bisons, or is it back to the women and the wives and the daughters who prepare after the kill, that they go out there and clean the meat and clean, and take the fur and take every meat, every possible thing from the animal that they can use, but also too as a symbolism of asking for forgiveness of the animal's spirit, because again, they are related. As I showed you with the Biscot Indians, they are to treat the animals as cousins. That many of the Native Americans, once they were on this kind of um, celebration, was also to use to ask for forgiveness at the same time too, permission to go out onto the hunt and to kill out of necessity these animals that they needed to survive. And after coming back, they would celebrate their great hunt and with another dance, but also again asking for forgiveness. So it's constantly reinforcing this tribal dependency, not only the tribe itself, but on a worldview as well, with the cosmology of the animals and the universe as well. Because for the Lakota Sioux Indians, everything dependent upon the hunt, because these were a hunter-gatherer community. And so typically the most common rituals that the Native Americans had were very similar to those that we still have in Western European societies as well as today, in commemorating the four stages of the human life cycle, whether it's birth, our reaching our maturity as both men and women, marriage as a significant moment of highly ritualized and religiousized, as well as death. And so I'm going to try to give you little aspects of each of these cultures at these moments. So for the Shoshone cultures, pregnant women were treated with great respect and great caution. And for other tribes as well, I think it's the Sioux as well, or the Apaches. Menstruating women were also seen with great care and great responsibility. That they believed that either women who were pregnant or women who were menstruating had some kind of special power and ability because of the nature of their body of going through change, and that they were the living embodiment of life itself, that life resided within them, whether it is through pregnancy or through the process of menstruation, that life breathes within the woman. And so the community would either treat them with extreme caution or extreme care. So for the Shoshone cultures, that they would actually, when the woman had become noticeably pregnant, that the husband would actually build a separate tent for her, that she was to reside inside the tent and that she was to kind of live this life of luxury for a while. Because if the woman experienced any pain, discomfort, it was the belief among the Shoshone that the cult that pain, that ill treatment had a karma-like effect on the rest of the community. And so if the child was born stillborn, if the child was born but had some great ailment, that it wasn't the woman's fault. It wasn't the man and the woman, the couple's fault. Wasn't the child's fault. Rather, it was the community's fault. The community as a whole was to blame because they obviously upsetted the spirits or upsetted the deities or upsetted this higher power. And so again, pregnant women among the Shoshone tribes were treated with great respect. Again, for the Apaches, women who were menstruating, again, it was believed that if a woman was angry, or if she was in great discomfort because of this natural process, and if the community of the tribe wasn't taking care of her, that because of her frustrations and the things that she was suffering from the cramps and stuff like that, that had a karma-like effect on the community as well. And so again, this there was all these kinds of ritualizations that would happen for these communities. In Inuit cultures, so these are Inuit Indians live up in Alaska or in the Northwest Territory in Canada, uh, that they would have a ceremony, a ritual ceremony known as a naming ceremony, in which every child when they reached a certain age after they were born, a certain time period, that they would be named after a great deceased ancestor. And it was the belief that if after they named the person after this ancestor, that the ancestor would actually come and reside and be able to reincarnate inside the child itself. And so many scholars believe that this was seen as an explanation of child deaths, and that child deaths were seen as ancestors being quite angry, and that their spirit leaving the child because there was a lack of respect for them as the ancestor in the community. So again, you can see some of these aspects and how again it's this very much tribal aspect that was around them. And so I kind of already talked about this as well for the Apache culture, that they would celebrate instead of, but this was a little bit different. Instead of like in the Jewish community that would, for a long period of time would celebrate the bar mitzvah, the celebration of when a boy becomes a man. In the Apache culture, it was quite different. It was the celebration of when a girl changes to a woman, and that being the time of her first menstruation. And so, when that would occur, according to Apache cultures, that they would gather, all the women would gather the woman, or the girl who was changing from a woman. They would proceed to have these kind of ritualizations, songs being sung, the cleaning of the body, through the menstruation process that the community of women would do to her, and they would also start educating her, the girl too, about the nature of why this is happening, and also her duties as now becoming a woman. They would also educate on her of what her role within her family unit was going to be, as well as what role it was going to be when she would become married as well. So there's very interesting aspects and different ritualizations. But what's unique about the Native American tribes is, unlike, say, for Christianity or Jews and Muslims, that not every native tribe was very concerned or even had a belief system about an afterlife. So, for example, in the Pueblo culture, so those Indians who resided out in New Mexico and Arizona, that they believed that the deceased would actually just become spirits, these Kanchi spirits that reside in the clouds, basically, and that they would, instead of this kind of an afterlife of going into this great heaven or this kind of beyond the world experiences, that they still resided here, that their bodies just merely transformed, but they still resided in this ethereal plane in which we live in as well. That particularly they would become spirits that either inhabited sacred areas or that more specifically would become rain clouds, which were very needed. So you still prayed to the ancestors. Among the Cheyennes, they actually did have some kind of belief system that they believed that you would pass into this to the existence of within the stars, that your soul would leave and go up into this shadow existence of night, and that you would live among the stars. And so all the ancestors are up in the stars, they're watching you, they're watching over us. For the Massachusetts Indians, that they believed that the soul would actually travel to a great field, so it's this kind of heaven for them, that they would travel to this great field of the great god Kanta, or in some translations, Tano, in which they would go and feast with their ancestors, and which is quite funny. And well, I find it quite funny and humorous, is that according to the Massachusetts traditions among these Indians, this kind of grassy field land where it was always warm and always sunny was, for them, was always located geographically south. So I always laugh and think that that it must be Florida, because what do, old retirees from New York and from Boston, what do they end up doing? They end up retiring, in South Florida, in Tampa and Miami. So maybe this is where this tradition comes from. It comes from the Massachusetts Indians that previously had this belief that once you retired, you would travel down south to where the great fields are, where it was always sunny and always warm and shiny. For the Navajo Indians, they actually didn't believe in no afterlife. They would and what was interesting too for the Navajo Indians for a spell, they actually didn't even bury the dead. That they would leave the body out in the open in this kind of area, this designated area where they could leave the body and the body would naturally decay over time and return back to the earth. But they didn't really believe in an afterlife, and so thus the Navajo Indians didn't really practice burials as we do, but they would have sacred sites, sacred rocks in which period people were, quote unquote buried, but they were left out to the exposure of the elements. But they also kind of did believe in ghosts, and that if the ancestors weren't treated properly, or these people weren't treated correctly in their life, that they might come back to seek revenge. So haunting ghosts kind of say whether it was murder, that the Navajo Indian died because of murder or because of neglect from the community. And so they kind of, for me, that's a belief in the afterlife. But typically, scholars would say no, the Navajo Indians didn't believe in the afterlife that we think of it as Western, Europeans and Western civilized religions like Christianity and Islam. But typically, like I said, I kind of say, yeah, they sort of did. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about with Native American cultures is the famous medicine men of Native American religions and cultures. So when Europeans started to encounter Native Americans, they wildly misunderstood the role that healing played inside the tribal cultures of the Native Americans. They saw Europeans typically thought of medicine men operating like priests, when in fact they were more like doctors. And so, but because of how the ceremonies were performed, they were, the religious sessions or the healing sessions, how they were performed, they looked like a religious ceremony. And so the Europeans couldn't tell the difference. So typically, medicine men and shamans who were religious professionals for the Native Americans kind of blended together. So, in Native American cultures, the term medicine in these indigenous American communities typically universally refer to spiritual healing. This is probably one aspect of Native American culture that was universal, that is universal, and that we can speak of with some level of certainty. That there was this belief that you were infected by some great social ill or some kind of spiritual ill when you were sick, that you were coughing, that you were running a fever, that your skin, was turned pale or you're sweating, from fever and sickness, that was seen as a spiritual ailment as well. And so it was these religious people who are these medicine healers who would come and perform these kind of ritualized ceremonies that looked very religious. And so, like I already said here, generally religious and historical scholars refer to these medicine men as shamans. Note, do note that the Native Americans never refer to these people as shamans, but European explorers first called them medicine men, and that terminology has kind of stuck. But scholars typically will say shaman. So if you read Corrigan, if he says shamans, he's talking about medicine men. So who were shamans? Like I said, shamans basically means, I think it comes from the Sanskrit, if I remember right. So because shamans also existed and still exist today in Hindu cultures and Indian cultures, basically just means someone who knows things, someone who has this advanced knowledge. So it always referred to this kind of religious professional who resided within the community or on the outskirts of the community who was skilled in particular things, particularly for Native Americans, skilled in herbalism, the use of herbal medicines. Sometimes also these shamans would have various roles as keepers of tribal traditions, tribal cultures, often sometimes interpreters on behalf of reading the signs, reading the elements, being able to predict the weather for the community, or to cast divinations using certain devices like sacred bones or dice or coins or arrows in order to make predictions of how they land once thrown or shot up in the air, stuff like that, that they could be able to make readings, or spiritual mediums too, that they could be able to communicate with the deceased or could be able to communicate with the spiritual world. And so within these Native American communities, the shamans were typically a reserved class of people. This was kind of a social hierarchy. That they were a reserved class, a higher class that sometimes would be co-equal, or if not, um, in certain circumstances, even greater than the chief or the main tribal leader. Sometimes the shamans were co-leaders, or like I said, in certain circumstances, the shamans would actually overrule the tribal leader in certain aspects. But typically they were a reserved class, and the role, so far from what we know, the role was typically passed down hereditarily, meaning that it was either passed down from from father to son, or sometimes in certain cultures, in the Native American culture, sometimes from mother to daughter only, or from father to daughter sometimes. So it was this particularly family lineage, but it wasn't really restricted by gender, but sometimes it was. Some cultures would only be women, some only men, but others it would just be within the hereditary line. So it could pass down from father to daughter or mother to son. And in the Native American cultures too, knowledge of medicine or of the medicine men or medicine women is typically Native Americans don't discuss it. So we don't know a lot about the cultures, their traditions. We don't know what they do except only from observation, because even today, Native American cultures are still kind of hush hush about it. And so even though the Cherokee Indians were the first Indians to have a written language down, and much of the information we do know about medicine men come from the Cherokee Indians, the written information about these people, um, they would typically use coded language so that we don't understand them and that we're not still sure what they mean. So you can go out there and get a medicine man textbook from the Cherokee Indians, and you might not be able to read it because, like I said, it's written in a coded language because the Native American cultures typically just do not give this information out. They're very reluctant about it. So we don't know a lot about them. So the only thing we know is from observations, from what we've seen. But still, like I say, in certain areas, medicine men are still out there. Certain reservations still actually have medicine men come out and perform rituals as well. So ultimately, why I say this is because, again, our knowledge about the medicine men is grossly inadequate and has been routinely misunderstood and misrepresented. So I'm not going to give too much, but what I do know and what I think we can be certain of, again, is this role of spiritual healing that is seen. And that illness is associated with a spiritual disease as well as something physical. So, thus, the medicine men blended in between kind of medical treatment and religious practices. And so, like I've already kind of talked about this as well, most Americans, Native Americans, believed in illness as being caused by a spiritual illness, and so some of them, Native American tribes, would call this soul loss, that your soul has actually departed from you. And so, for certain Native American tribes or shamans, that it was believed that the shaman would perform these rituals in order to bring back your soul, to go out there and capture it in the spiritual world and to bring it back, and thus causing you to recover. And that's why your body is becoming sick, is it because it's becoming deteriorated, because your soul has left the body, and that when death is all death is the permanent status of the soul leaving the body and not coming back. And so a shaman could possibly bring the soul back, but if it's far too gone, then for the shaman or the medicine man, it was belief that this, the spirit world, there was a powerful spirit that was at work that counteracted him. Or sometimes that it's because of the community had done something wrong in preventing the shaman to be able to do what his stuff. So it was again this interconnectivity as well. But with the arrival of the Europeans and the establishment of Christianity, the practice of Native American traditional beliefs were highly discouraged and highly banned. Really starting in the 1790s, and got more intensified in the 1820s, and then particularly in the 1880s. Native American practices were discouraged and banned in America, and so forcing a lot of Native American practices to go underground or fade out entirely. And so, strangely enough, in a country that prides itself on religious beliefs and religious practice and freedom of expression, it wasn't until 1978, with the Jimmy Carter administration, that American Indians were granted their freedom of religion. That is one of the most tragic things about the U.S. treatment of the Native American population, that they were not given that right with the First Amendment, because many U.S. courts, and still U.S. courts today, do not consider Native Americans fully citizens. That they are, at times American citizens, but also at times they're citizens of sovereign tribes and sovereign states, whether it's the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole Indians that we have around us today. And so, again, it wasn't until the 1978 that Native American practices could come out in the open again. And so we have, since 78, a kind of rebirth of Native American practices and traditions and ceremonies, under being undertaken and being revived by Native American communities. However, because of this, 200, at times 200-year period where practices were banned in certain regions, many of these traditions began to fade away quickly. And so the practices that are being revived might not actually be whole cloth original, that they are adoptions, or they're kind of constructed revivals that might not actually be 100% true. Okay, so now this is a brief discussion of Native American cultures and their religions and their societies here in America. Very briefly, I want to talk about a quick survey of African contexts and religions and cultures. So first, I want to talk about the survey of African and European contact, because to understand African Americans' role in the United States, you got to understand their roots with European contact. And what I really mean by that is slavery. So to understand the roots of the African American tradition here in America, you got to have a comprehension understanding of slavery as well. So early European contact with the subcontinent of Africa. And so when I mean early European, I mean the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the early Christian kingdoms of the late antiquity prior to 1000. Early European contact with the subcontinent of Africa. And what I mean by subcontinent is past the Sahara Desert. So North Africa and Egypt, Europeans had lots and lots of contact with. But outside of the Sahara Desert, and we get down to, the sub-Sahara plains of Africa, or the Congolese jungles of Africa, or southern Africa, European contact was quite limited. We do know that Europeans did have trading relationships with, areas of today that are known as Ethiopia and Sudan and Somalia. And we do know of Roman trade as far south as the Cape of Africa, but it was very brief. So we do know that Roman traders were able to actually skirt the coast of Africa all the way to modern day South Africa. But still, the contact with basically black Africans, not Arab Africans, North Africans, was very significantly limited. But however, we start getting with the emergence of various Muslim caliphates in northern and western Africa, contact was still limited, but it started to pick up. And it was also picked up because of, you see these legendary tales and histories about forgotten kingdoms. And so one of the most famous ones is the French, from a French novelist, Jules Ferrer, in his famous novel from the medieval times, River of Gold, in which he talks about El Dorado, and that it being in Africa, this area in Africa that was known for its wealth and gold and riches. And so now soon Europeans started to actually look towards Africa, to the subcontinent of Africa, for the very first time. And what aided it was really, modern Europeans started to reestablish contact with sub-Sahara Africa, due to the Portuguese and the beginning of sea navigation and traveling. So the Portuguese were the first to kind of travel down past modern day Morocco into modern day Niger and Sierra Leone and the Ivory Coast, in parts of West Africa for the very first time, starting in the 1400s, as they began to look for sea trade routes to India. So Europeans wanted to find trade routes to India and to Southeast Asia, because they were tired of Muslim domination. They were tired of having to deal with third-party interests. They were tired of Venetian dominance. And so with the beginning of the construction of the three-sail mast and the movable sail, and construction of faster and stronger ships on the waters, and better navigational charts and better navigational skills, Western European cultures began to believe that they could find routes, sea routes, through Africa. So they started to explore all of the rivers, the major rivers, the Niger River, the Congo River, in Africa, to find a trade route to India. So they wouldn't have to deal with the Venetians, wouldn't have to deal with the remaining of the Byzantine Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim empires. They wouldn't have to deal with them. They could go straight to the source themselves. And so eventually, because Christopher Columbus was a part of that, Christopher Columbus accidentally discovered America because he was trying to find a navigational route towards India and Asia. Eventually, that was happened in 1498 when Vasco da Gama discovered India, the trade route, or not a trade route, a navigable sailing route around the Cape of Africa to India in 1498. And therefore, Africa started to operate for the Western Europeans as a base of operations, for them to resupply their ships, to fix their ships, for nasty storms out at sea, or also to trading goods along the way as they would go to India and vice versa. But when it was the discovery of gold actually did happen by Europeans around 1443, that Europeans, instead of looking at Africa as just merely a resupply station along the way to India, they started to actually look at establishing inroads. and building trading posts in West Africa because they wanted gold. And so now you have European influences and our European concerns with West Africa. But unfortunately for West Africa, there's a history of slave trade. And the slave trade didn't start with the modern day Europeans, but in fact, slavery in Africa is as old as the Roman Empire. We do know that the Romans did deal with and traded with Ethiopian slaves. The Muslim empires as well dealt with and traded slave trades in between Europe and India and in Malaysia. And so the Africans were routinely traded for slavery. And slavery involved several different ways in Africa. The most common, the one that we typically associate with, is chattel slavery, the selling of property, that slaves were seen as property, that you would buy a person to be your slave, whether in your house or out in the fields, or to build constructions for city projects or government projects. Typically, this was the most common form of slavery. That's chattel traders would go out and steal people, basically. They would go out and raid a village, and that they would steal these individuals, and that they would go and turn around and sell them for profit. But there was also other kinds of form of slavery, again, that goes all the way back to the Roman period. Typically, the second most common, well, probably say after military slaves as being the second most common, the third was debt. One way to pay off your debts was to sell yourself in slavery, and slavery was again a most common thing. Even the Old Testament speaks of selling oneself into slavery to pay your debts off as a legitimate way for slavery. And many of the early Americans who came, or early Europeans who came to America, many of them came under this range of pawnship or debt bondage slavery, meaning the Europeans came over to America as that, not the West Africans. The West Africans typically were chattel slaveries. But the Irish, some of the early Irishes were who came to America were part of this debt bondage slavery, as well as some British people as well. The state of Georgia was kind of founded under this principle as well. Many of these debt slavers coming to Georgia in order to work off, in order to pay their debts. Massachusetts as well was very common for this for a very long period of time. But very rarely was there human sacrifice as a part of slavery, but it was there. Certain tribes did sell people into slavery in order to perform human sacrifices to appease the gods, but it was quite rare. Typically, it was because of chattel, people wanted to make money, or because of military service. It was easier to put a slave in the army as an infantryman and put him on the first line to absorb the first wave because you're not paying him anything. And as we say here, unfortunately, everybody was guilty with the African slave trade. It wasn't just a European problem. The Muslims who controlled much of the area typically sold many slaves and were a facilitator of the slave trade in Africa. And unfortunately, too, many of the African warlords or kings or chieftains also would sell their people into slavery in order to either spare their village or to pay off debts as well, or make money too. That many of the African kingdoms would sell their own people as well in order to make money. So nobody's hands were purely innocent in this African slave trade. The only one that were in fact those who were sold into slavery, unfortunately. Originally, European colonizers had enslaved the indigenous population in America. So really when Christopher Columbus, when he first came to America in 1492, one of the very first things that he wrote about was that his belief that the native population there in Puerto Rico and later Cuba and the Dominican islands, the native population there were fantastic slaves, that they could be made into slavery. And Christopher Columbus tried. trying to make the indigenous populations there become slaves. However, the problem was, is again, European diseases caused many of the indigenous populations to quickly die out and be useless in terms of being a slaved population. And so this is really why the Europeans started to turn towards the Africans, is because the Africans already were immune to many of the European diseases. And so thus the the Europeans started to turn to Africa and bring them over to the New World in order to work the sugarcane fields, to work the gold mines, and many of the Caribbean islands. And so our earliest account that we know of West African slaves making it to the New World there and the Dominican Republic and Haitian, the island there, was in 1503. So not even 20 years after Christopher Columbus discovered the New World do we have West African slaves now working in the Caribbean. And so it's suspected that the slave trade continued, dominated by the UK eventually, but begun by the Portuguese, taken over by the Spaniards, taken over by the French, but then really dominated by the British. Slave trade had continued up until 1808 when the US and the United States also banned its practice of happening. Under Thomas Jefferson's administration, he banned the practice of the slave trade. But slavery didn't die out until really in West Africa, West Africans being used as slaves until the start of the American Civil War in 1860. And some people would say here in America that slavery still hasn't died out, that it's still going on, but it has been uh, the names have changed. In the Jim Crow era, it hasn't died out as well, that the name has only changed. Um, but is estimated, scholars have estimated that around 11 to 15 million Africans were enslaved during this period. So from 1503 all the way up until the 1860s, 11 to 15 million West Africans were rooted up from their homes, were taken to a foreign land in which they do not speak, to live among foreign people and to work horrible jobs and to die ultimately in a foreign land, which was is just one of the most saddest aspects of human history. And it is believed, it's estimated that over 400,000 to 600,000 West Africans were brought to the United States, with the first West African slave coming to America in 1619, I believe, in Jamestown, Virginia. So it has just been one of the great disgraces of human existence and of European history and American history, that from our very roots as a country, we have been founded as a slave nation and on the backs of slaves. So let's talk about the traditional West African religions, those religions that existed in West Africa that possibly have influences early on in American culture. Because eventually the traditional West African religions will be distilled down for America, it's distilled down into voodooism. So scholars typically distinguish between three forms of religion that is commonly practiced in Africa at the time of the foundation of the United States or of the American colonies, as well as still going on today. That in Africa today, that there are still some traditional African religions that are still practiced, that are still done in cultures and African cultures today, but there's now a significant minority, probably anywhere from 3 to close to 10% of African populations still practice traditional African forms of religion. Probably the most second common, largest, and still growing is the practice of Islam, in Northern Africa and West Africa and East Africa. Islam is a growing denomination of faith that has been in Africa since the six since 16 or not 16 since 627, that Islam has been in Africa. But the largest religion in Africa and still today is in fact Christianity. Traditional African religions are very similar to those discussed in Native American religions. They're very much tribal in their aspects. And so many of the same principles and belief systems that I talked about are already quite present. So we don't need to go so much into them. But there are some nuances that I didn't talk about with Native American religions that apply more so to West African religions here. So nearly all of the traditions that we do have about West African religions are oral, meaning that they're spoken of. And so there's no scripture, there's no written elements of what we see here. And typically, West African religions vary between a combination of either animism to polytheism or henotheism, and we'll talk about those, to a kind of pantheism. And so, what do I mean by anism? So, anism is a religious belief that objects, certain specific objects or certain specific places, and creatures in general, all possess a distinctive spiritual essence. So, it's not the worship of animals that you think of animism, but that objects have intimate, animated life within them, spirits that make them breathe and move. And so that creatures, the reason why creatures move, why trees grow, is because they are possessed by a soul. And why creatures move and trees sway and grow and things like that is because they have a spirit within them. And so you have certain sacred objects, certain sacred areas are also dominated by religious, these religious spiritual beliefs as well. And we kind of have animism still here today. We consider things like um, churches, inside a church to be holy ground, places where God resides, inside mosques to be holy ground, synagogues to be holy ground, places where God resides. But also other objects we have that we treat as sacred and holy, things like Arlington National Cemetery in Washington. Things like cemeteries in general, that they are sacred and holy areas that shouldn't be defamed by illicit behaviors. Objects like, sacred sites like the 9/11 Memorial becomes this place. So even Western cultures, we still have this kind of neo form of animism that's still around today. Henotheism, and what do I mean by henotheism? It is the belief that there's one God, one patron God, in which one worships over the other gods. And so you believe in a host of deities. So it's sort of like polytheism, which believes in many gods, but that you give devotion with henotheism, you give devotion to one God above others. And so if you think about in the Ten Commandments, the first commandment, that you're not to have any other gods before me, that's a statement of henoism. And so thus the ancient Israelites were in fact henotheistic before they became monotheists. That they believed in one God above other gods, and the Old Testament does demonstrate it. The Arab communities prior to the establishment of Islam, the Arab communities typically were henotheistic communities as well, that they worshipped one patron god above other patron gods. Pantheism. Now, pantheism is a religious belief that all things, or sometimes all reality, is either identical or is composed of the divine. So that I am made of the divine, elements of God reside within me, that man is God because elements of God resides within me, or that I am a part of the universe because elements of the universe reside within me. Um, that's so it's kind of pantheism is kind of a blending of animism, but it's the belief that everything is God, that everything is sacred, everything is divine, and that He is everywhere. So typically, for a lot of these traditional African religions, um, I feel like traditional African religions can be broken down among common linguistical or cultural groupings, whereas Native American religions are quite hard to identify because they're so diverse and their history is a little more problematic than West African religions are. West African religions or traditional African religions can be broken along these linguistical or cultural groupings. So we're going to talk about African religions, but within these specific culture groups, and we're going to isolate one particular culture, one example within this culture group that gives you an understanding. So the first one are those that are considered the Niger cultures or the Congo cultures. So between the Niger River, which is in West Africa, if you look at the West Africa as kind of the thumb that sticks out of Africa as the peninsula, it's West Africa where the Niger River begins is at the bottom of the thumb. And so from there to the Congo River, which would be the base, in the middle there of your thumb, in your palm. So this area in West Africa along the coastal region. So many of the traditional things among them is that they believed in this kind of creator God or this higher form of deity, as well as other gods. So kind of henotheistic. They believed in one God among other gods, but they also believed in ancestral spirits, territorial spirits, spirits that resided within certain areas, but instead of spirits being able to travel to other areas, that in fact they only resided within these areas, and that evil was caused by humans neglecting the evil spirits. So typically they would believe in this higher creator God, these cultures, but this higher creator God was completely unknowable. And it was the work of lesser gods and deities that did actual the work on heaven or did the work on earth. And so there was this kind of it's sort of a form of deism in which that deists believe that there's this creator God who's out there, that he created the earth and then left it to spin on itself. Similar ideas here among the Niger and Congolese people, that you have this creator God who created the earth and then let it spin in its fashions. And so typically the Niger and Congolese cultures that they would typically appease not the creator God, but appease these lesser spirits or these lesser deities instead of the creator God. So the most common example among these is among the Yoruba people. And so similarly, they believe in this creator God, Olorun, who created the earth, created everything within it. He created the earth, and instead of creating man, he left the work of that to lesser spirits, in which he called Urisas, who acted as uh, uh, intermediaries between the creation and the higher God themselves. And so these lesser spirits could be good, these lesser spirits could be evil, but they had to be constantly appeased. And so thus you would make sacrifices not to the chief God, the creator God, Olorun, but you would make sacrifices and appeasements to these lesser spirits who would in turn act as uh, emissaries between you and the chief god. So among the Nilo-Sahara culture, so this is Egyptian, the Nile River, the lower half of the Nile River, and the Sahara Desert cultures here. What we see instead of this kind of like the Niger culture that was more henotheistic, for the Nilo-Sahara cultures, they believed in a pantheon of gods, believed in evil as being caused by the gods as divine judgment and retribution on people. And so typically you would have a more centralized idea of worship or religion. You would have elements of prophets and priests who would serve as middlemen between the divine and the humanity instead of these evil spirits or these ancestors, as you see like in Niger and Congolese cultures. So the prime example of these would be the Dinka people in Sudan area, that they believed in a supreme deity called the Nilik, who is the god of the skies and the rain and rules all of over the spirits, and that in Nilik, he's also present in creation and controls all the destiny of all things, but that he has lesser deities as well. As he has a pantheon of gods around him, his son, his daughter, his wife, and they all have these cultures around them. But probably the most famous example is the ancient Egyptians that we think of, the pantheon of gods within them of Amun-Ra, of Horus, the god of, oh, I can't think of the god of the underworld right now. But anyhow, that you'd have the typical idea of what you think of the ancient Egyptians. This is the type of culture that we have here. The Afro-Asiatic cultures, and so these are the cultures in northern Africa here, and more closer to the Atlantic side instead of the Mediterranean part. They believed in a form of henotheism and that evil was caused by malevolent spirits as well. So very similar to the Niger Congolese people, but this is probably the most harder culture to distinguish between because of Christian influences very early on in Northern Africa, because of Muslim influences very early on in Africa, it's very hard to distinguish between these groups. But it's really believed that the Berber people who live in the mountains and the mountains in Morocco and Algeria are the best examples. But then too, the Berber people, much of their culture, even though it's because of the mountains, they were able to be isolated. There are still elements of Christianity and Muslim influences within them as well. So they're probably the hardest to talk about. But again, they had a form of henotheism that they would believe in one chief deity that they would, or patron deity that they would worship above others. But they would see evil in the world being caused by evil spirits that must be appeased. And so you would still make sacrifices to the spirits rather than make sacrifices to the chief god in whom you're wanting to worship. And so for southern Africa, the Sahan cultures, they typically tended to be non-theistic, more pantheistic. They believed in a great spirit or a great power that was within each of us and within the universes, and that power, that spirit could be experienced through various different ritualizations and experiences. And so whether it was the use of hallucinative drugs, or whether it's dancing, or whether it's trances that would be done, this is how you would have experiences with the deities. And so many of the most famous examples are still today the indigenous tribes of Botswana and Nambia, where the shamans would perform trance dances, or known as healing dances, where an illness is attributed to a certain spirit, and the shaman would have to physically, through the ritual dance, hunt the spirit, or through the power of a spirit animal, be able to go through this ritual trance. And then also ingestions of herbal hallucinogens in order to also have this kind of religious experience within them as well. But ultimately, all these cultures, similarly to the Native American ones, also played ancestral spirits played a vital role in these cultures and in these religions as well. So the last thing I want to talk about is the arrival of Islam and Christianity to Africa, or to West Africa. Because while Islam is not typically associated with the religious identity of Africa, over 48% of Africans today are Muslims. And for the slave trade, it's about 15 I would get it up to 25%, but most scholars typically give it the low number. I would give it a higher number, but anywhere from 15 to 25% of the slave population that came to the United States were Muslim. And so, again, Islam came to the United States very early, just as much as with Christianity. So Islam came to West Africa through the various traders, particularly the Berber traders in Morocco, and Arab clerics, particularly Sufi clerics. And I'm not sure if we'll talk about Sufism, but we'll get to that Sufism much later. And its various practices. It was thus able to make inroads within, within various African tribes and practices. They were able to kind of create elements of syncretism as well with African traditions. Were they able to blend in certain elements of African traditions with Islamic thought? So today, the majority of Africans or African Muslims are in fact Sunni Muslims, or they're practitioners of Sufism, which is this kind of form of mystical form of Islam. And most exercised Islam with considerable autonomy, meaning that they didn't have religious authorities over them. So many of the practices of African Muslims were not always universally understood or universally the same, because there was no religious body of ulmas, Islamic scholars, that would give rulings and practices. So it typically, again, is African forms of Islam tended to blend together traditional African tribal forms of religion as well. And so many of the enslaved Africans were in America, and so there's many examples. So very early, of the two most famous of the early from the 1600s and 1700s of African Muslims coming to America, and very prominent were Suleiman Dalio and Or. I think that's supposed to be Omar Ibn Said. And Ibn Said was probably the most famous of the two. In fact, that he learned how to write later on, and actually uh, wrote and translated many Muslim texts into English for Americans for a first time. So he's probably the most famous of the two. But however, for Christianity, outside of the Barbary Coast, which is Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, the coastlines of those countries, and Egypt and Ethiopia, Christianity had really no influence in the central part of Africa until the arrival of European explorers. It was an area that was dominated by Islam, and still kind of dominated by Islam today. But because of the British Empire and the European countries and colonizations, Christianity made significant inroads, but still dominated by Christianity or by Islam for a long period of time. In 1491, eventually the Kingdom of Congo set the standard for the rest of Africa, and that the Kingdom of Congo officially became a Christian kingdom, and thus allowed many Jesuit priests, Catholic priests, and missionaries to make large inroads into Central Africa, and eventually being able to colonize and Christianize much of the area. Similar to many of the Muslims, it was the Jesuits' practices that they started to translate Christian teachings into local cultural understanding. So, for example, the chief deity of the Congolese people was known as Nzambi Amapunga, and he eventually, for the Jesuits, they just made him synonymous with Jehovah God, with God of the Old Testament. And so similarly, many of the Jesuits, that in turn they made many of the local deities to become converted into Christian saints. So it made it easier for many of the Congolese people to convert to Christianity, because there was this form of syncretism being involved. And so eventually, this kind of syncretism led to a new religious movement that formed in Africa. And so what it became known as is Antonism, but Antonism is also a broad term as well. But so, for example, in Congo and around the start of the 1700s, one eventually emerged in Congo was a prophetess, a woman prophet who emerged, who famously converted to Christianity, and she had a famous vision of Christ coming to her and saying that, and what she saw was Christ wasn't white, but Christ was black. And so she spoke to Christ, and Christ said that the story of the Bible, the Europeans had got it wrong, that Christ never lived in Palestine, never lived in Israel, never lived in Jerusalem, that this was all a white understanding or white misunderstanding or a white lie, basically. But instead, according to her, um, she actually experienced that Christ told her that no, I am an African and that my life story was here in Africa. And instead of being baptized in the Jordan River, I was baptized in the Congolese River. That instead of Jerusalem, that I died in the capital city of Congo, which I can't remember the name of it at the time, and that I am an African like you, and that my faith is that of an African faith. And so she started to lead a rebellious movement that Christianity is more in line with what Africans are, and that Christ, the Christ of the Bible, is more an African than he is a European. And so it started a revolution in Africa that actually trickled down into America much later on. But then eventually, many of the Christians, leaders and overrules, decided that we can't convert the Africans to our faith because they'll start reading, start understanding that the Bible teaches against slavery and that the Jesus of the Bible preaches against slavery. And so many of the European countries that controlled much of this territory made it so that African slaves could not be converted and would discourage people from converting them. So that same practice actually translated into America as well for a time being until we get to the Great Awakening. And so, like I said, the problem was that once there were literate Christian slaves, that became a huge problem in America. So probably the most famous example early on was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, when a bunch of slaves who had converted to Christianity started to eventually learn how to read the Bible for themselves, and they started reading where the Bible is anti-slavery, where Christ is preaching against slavery. And so thus started a rebellion in many of the slave communities. And thus many of the slavers and slave traders and slave owners prevented and just highly discouraged people and missionaries to come to these African communities and would try to hide the facts of the Bible from them because they were afraid if they started to read it, they would understand it.